Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Innovating under Article 6, Emerging Models for Public and Private Sector Cooperation under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We're really pleased to have you all with us here, and I think more attendees will join over the next few minutes as the webinar gets started. My name is Hugh Salway, and I am Head of Markets at Gold Standard. So just to get started, in the 25 pages of the Paris Agreement, there are 2 references to the private sector. Both of these are in Article 6, and that really encapsulates the important role that the private sector has in mobilising action, driving investment under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and through carbon markets. But this isn't a role that the private sector will play in silo. For Article 6 to work effectively in the years ahead, we'll need both the public sector and the private sector, governments and businesses, to work together, each playing their own important function to drive emission reductions through market mechanisms. And over the past period since COP26 and in the years before that as well, we started to see some interesting models for how the public sector and the private sector can work and are starting to work together under Article 6, including from the 2 governments which are represented on the panel today by our panelists. We're also starting to hear calls from private actors for the steps that they would like to see governments take to enable action under Article 6. And we're seeing more dialogue taking place between public actors and private actors within borders and across national borders internationally. So there's some questions that we've got for this webinar. How can governments enable private investment under Article 6? And how can the private sector support the achievement of government's targets? And the important question, are things moving fast enough for the action that we'll need to see delivered? We have a really excellent panel here today to answer these questions and to go a little bit more into the work which they're doing, some of the recommendations which they're giving, and some of the steps that they want to see in the future. So I'm really pleased to introduce my panel. Firstly, we have Katie Eberle, who is Manager for International Partnerships in the Australian Department for Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. We also have Veronika Elgart, who is Deputy Head of International Climate Policy in the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. Adriaan Korthuis, who is Co-founder and Managing Partner at Climate Focus. And Andrea Bonzanni, who is International Policy Director at IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And before we start, there's just one procedural point for how this is going to work. So we're going to ask questions of our panelists first, and we'll spend the first half hour or so having a discussion amongst the panelists. And then after we've done that, there's going to be a little bit of time for your questions. So as we go through, if you have questions that you want to ask one panelist or any of the panelists in general, please feel free to write those questions in the chat, and we will pick up as many of them as we can as we go through the question section at the end. So we're going to get into it now. And Katie, I'm going to come to you first. You're involved, Katie, in the development of Australia's Indo-Pacific carbon offset scheme, which is bringing together governments, the private sector and non-profits to generate carbon credits in countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Could you share a little bit more about the scheme, about how public-private cooperation is integrated into it, and any lessons for other countries from the work that you're doing?
Thanks very much, Hugh. Thanks for the introduction, and apologies in advance if I have any connection issues. I've been dropping in and out a little bit on the old internet. It's great to be with all my esteemed colleagues to discuss these emerging cooperative models under Article 6 here today. And I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. So I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I live and work on, and offer my respect for their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of Canberra and our region here in Australia. I also want to offer my respect to all First Nation elders, past, present and emerging, who have joined us here today as well. Many of you might be aware that Australia's approach to climate change policy and action has recently undergone something of a sea change with the swearing in of a new federal government in Australia last month. We're still settling in to understand the government's priorities in detail, but one thing that is very clear is that they have a very strong commitment to tackling climate change, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, which is tremendous for those of us who are managing an Indo-Pacific carbon offset scheme. We call it IPCOS for short, and through IPCOS, Australia will be partnering with the private sector and with countries across the region to address climate change through the market mechanism of Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. So today I want to share with you a little bit the role that we see for the Australian government in this, some of the key elements we're designing into the IPCOS, and the approach we want to take to growing the participation of the private sector in carbon markets in the region. IPCOS is a $104 million 10-year commitment to mitigation cooperation with our Indo-Pacific partners. Mitigation is of course important, but we do recognise the broad range of non-carbon benefits that high integrity carbon offsetting delivers, from biodiversity protection through to improved livelihoods. We've got a long way to go ahead of us, given that it's a decade-long program, but the Australian government was very honoured to establish our first partnerships at COP26 with Fiji and Papua New Guinea. So I want to acknowledge them and welcome them to IPCOS straight away. We do hope to establish further partnerships within our region in the near future. So when we talk about a government program that employs a market-based mechanism, I guess the first natural question is, what is the proper role of government? Our experience has been that both Australian companies and countries in our region are looking for the support and engagement of the Australian government on carbon markets. They are asking us to help them reduce risks, build sustainable policy and technical capacity, and help them identify project partners, a little bit perhaps like a marriage broker. IPCOS has the advantage of being able to draw on Australia's own long experience stimulating private sector investments in offset markets domestically. We can also leverage our recognised experience in measurement, reporting and verification of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. We have done a lot of MRV work in the region over the years. We build on strong existing regional and bilateral partnerships, which have grown naturally through climate and non-climate programs, but particularly through our provision of climate science and projections in the region, adaptation and resilience programs and other technical capacity building. We want IPCOS to be truly responsive and demand driven, both from the perspective of our private sector partners and from partner countries. We want it to be designed and delivered in collaborative, non-exploitative and mutually beneficial partnerships between the private sector, national governments and communities. So we're naturally committed to a measured side-by-side and collaborative approach to learning and working across the carbon value chain. We're already working fairly closely with the private sector here in Australia, with NGOs and civil society, Indigenous groups, academia and our partner countries. And together we want to co-design IPCOS in a way that shares and learns from each other's diverse and rich knowledge and experience. I need to emphasise that, of course, this is a process that is going to take time as well as money. And I suppose when we talk about lessons learned, I think doing that measured pace, relationship building, deep investment of time, they're some of the key things that we have have emerged from our past work on things like REDD+ and the FCPF. I suspect we might be talking a little bit more about integrity today, so I want to note that we hope that IPCOS can bolster and grow both supply side and demand side integrity for carbon markets. Supply side integrity for our partner countries includes critical concepts like clear national policy frameworks that serve the national interest and help countries meet their own climate commitments, their NDCs, a governance and institutional system that delivers timely and durable project authorisations, something that our private sector partners have flagged as important for them, empowered decision making based on free, prior and informed consent. I think this removal of information asymmetry is a really critical role for government. Measurable and ongoing community benefits, hopefully to get those priced into offsets, strengthened technical capacity, transparent and robust accounting and reporting for carbon trades. On the flip side of that, demand side integrity is equally important to us. For our private sector partners, that might include genuine efforts to decarbonise their own operations wherever possible, using offsets for their hard to abate emissions where appropriate technologies don't yet exist. investing in authorised projects that have been correspondingly adjusted, not necessarily seeking out the least cost abatement in our partner countries. We call this the low-hanging fruit. That'll be required by our partner countries to meet their unconditional NDCs. So we're asking our partners, our private sector partners, to share new technologies, methodological developments, and perhaps seek out abatement that sits a little higher on that MAC curve. I'll just quickly run through some of the key elements of IPCOS. It starts by establishing agreements on mitigation cooperation under Article 6 with our partner countries. We're focused on the Indo-Pacific. Working with those partners to help them develop their own fit-for-purpose policy frameworks and the capacity to participate in an informed manner in global carbon markets. And then there's a suite of potential tools that we might offer depending on the national context, from de-risking the investment environment, addressing legal readiness gaps, developing abatement analysis and digital opportunity mapping that can be used to calculate potential carbon emissions, when and where those things might occur, choosing the right policy tool to address the need for emissions reduction. We want those tools, or the suite of tools, or the set that they choose, to help partners make those informed decisions about their level of participation in markets and identify those projects that they wish to authorise for international trading. We're at the point now in our process of developing program guidelines in consultation with the private sector here in Australia, and those guidelines are going to set out criteria for approving carbon offset projects under IPCOS that create robust high integrity offsets with co-benefits of importance to local communities. The Australian government is going to fund or part fund demonstration projects in partner countries that offer the private sector assurance that our projects produce carbon offsets that are high in integrity, and help to create a future pipeline of investment from the private sector in those priority climate projects. Additionally, in the background and as a kind of an underpinning to the scheme, we'll also be working on improving reporting coverage of emissions in the region across sectors, so being able to draw more sectors into NDCs and therefore make more abatement available for trading, and also to help build mutual confidence in our claimed outcomes, and giving the region a stronger voice in global standard setting on transparency in inventory systems as well. Feedback from Australian corporates has indicated a lot of enthusiasm to invest in Indo-Pacific projects, but there have also been some really important concerns that they've raised, which we're feeding into program design. I guess some of those really important things we need to do to help corporations protect their reputations and avoid being accused of greenwashing or being carbon cowboys are really critical. Many countries in our region are still building their understanding of the implications of selling abatement, of understanding the detail of Article 6 and the rulebook associated with it. And we are really all working our way through the implications of the rulebook, at any rate, all of us. So we're going to work with partners, public and private, to build that knowledge and build those capabilities to trade, and really focus in on those higher hanging fruit that I mentioned. To build institutional capacity, to build strong governance systems, to encourage informed decision making. And these things are going to help de-risk the investment environment for the private sector and allow for timely decision making on project authorisations. And that transparent reporting that we're encouraging will help give confidence that the traded abatement is genuine and won't result in negative social or environmental outcomes. So obviously there's a lot to be done now and in the years ahead, but by working closely with our Indo-Pacific neighbours and private sector partners, we'll be building and sharing new knowledge and understanding and harnessing the power of market mechanisms for people and the climate. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Katie. And I mean, there's so much to dig into, so hopefully we'll get some good questions which come through on this, and we'll be able to come back to some of the things which you shared there, because I think it's a really interesting, exciting model for how Article 6 can be applied and how you can bring together all of the different pieces which you just talked about. So thank you for that. Veronika, we're going to come over to you now. Did someone say something? No, talking, Veronika, about kind of interesting and leading models for the implementation of Article 6. Everyone's aware that Switzerland is at the forefront of Article 6 implementation, and it feels like every time you look at Carbon Pulse, you look on LinkedIn, you see another example of a bilateral agreement or a joint declaration that the Swiss government has entered into with a new country. So there's a lot which is going on the Swiss side. One of the important features of your bilateral agreements is that, as well as allowing mitigation outcomes, emission reductions, to be authorised for use towards Switzerland's NDC, you also allow them to be authorised for use by the private sector, which I think is a really interesting example of using the fact that Article 6 allows for mitigation outcomes to be used not just for NDCs, but for other purposes as well. It'd be great if you could share a little bit more about the motivation behind this and any work linked to this or outside of it that you're doing with private actors looking to source carbon credits with corresponding adjustments.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to engage on this broader aspect of the Swiss agreements. And first and foremost, the agreements we're achieving, that's together with our partner countries. So it's not just a Swiss engagement, but a success together with our partners, definitely. But absolutely, you're right. So the Swiss agreements, 7 to date, they allow any private or public entity to use the agreements to generate Itmos, purchase Itmos, use Itmos for any mitigation objective. In some very concrete examples, that means a private entity can generate and purchase Itmos and surrender it for NDC achievement of a country, or a private or public entity can generate and purchase Itmos for the use of a voluntary mitigation objective, such as a net zero target. So it can be a private company, it can be a city, it can be a state that is flexible in the agreements. And in fact, the agreements even do not have territorial restrictions in most cases. So even entities domiciled outside of Switzerland can use these agreements if just to test out this approach, if that's wished so. And you're asking me on the motivation behind this. So first and foremost, it is that the Swiss government itself has got a voluntary climate objective on top of the Swiss NDC. We have a voluntary objective to reduce and compensate remaining emissions of the Swiss administration. And the Swiss Federal Council has repeatedly stated its intention to avoid any double counting claiming in this voluntary engagement. So, of course, if this is, the choice of the Swiss government, the way to go to avoid any overlaps with other mitigation objectives, we have every endeavor to provide the same opportunity to any other private or public entity. This is why the agreements can also be used at such a broad scope. To us, it's very clear that the Paris Agreement introduces a new quality to carbon credits and the carbon market. It is the notion that a recognized Itmo is only counted once. Doesn't matter whether it is an NDC or a voluntary objective, but a recognized Itmo is only counted once. And that is a quality that we have every endeavor to provide access to for any private and public entity. So in a very nutshell, if you ask me what the motivation behind this broad scope of the Swiss agreements is, well, we strongly believe this benefits the climate. If voluntary carbon markets add on to NDCs of countries, this unarguably increases the climate effect rather than if they overlap. It also benefits, in our view, the host country. Our bilateral scheme puts the host country in the driving seat. The host country can guide these investments, develop a strategy how to use international carbon markets, and unlock high barrier climate action and activities that benefit its population most and its low carbon development. And very finally, we ourselves, that's why we're going this path, we believe this also benefits the buyer of these credits because we believe it increases the climate effect that stands behind each of these Itmos. So this is the very nutshell why we are engaging this broader scope and provide access to any entity for these not double claimed or counted Itmos. And if you allow me just very briefly to touch on 2 points on how this can be done, then for a third party, for a private or public entity. Well, the agreement, and I'm coming back to Katie's point before, the role of the Swiss government and our partner governments, as we defined it, is very much setting the framework conditions. The activities are financed and also implemented, generally speaking, there's flexibility, but generally speaking, by third parties, often the private sector. So it is the third entity, be it public or private, that can approach the two cooperating governments, suggest a mitigation activity, And if the two governments authorize under the bilateral agreement, the framework conditions are clear, the rules of the games are clear, and the third party benefits from guarantees of the government. There's legal certainty provided for that Itmo will be recognized by the official countries and that we will avoid double counting and claiming through the bookkeeping. And also throughout the implementation of the activity, the government's role remains framework conditions and ground rules based. The commercial agreements between seller and buyer also is directly between the engaging entities, the project partners, and does not go through the governments. And thereby, we very much hope to set up, whether for NDC achievement or for other mitigation purposes, a very viable market, actually, with a lot of direct engagement of a variety of entities.
Great, thanks very much for that, Veronika. And Adriaan, we're coming over to you now. One of the things that Veronika talked about there is the potential for host countries to use carbon markets to support their national objectives and kind of for this to be something which is very much owned. And that was at the heart of work which Climate Focus led last year through the Voluntary Carbon Market Global Dialogue, which was a very sponsored initiative that was looking to bring developing countries to the center of discussions about the future of the voluntary carbon market. So we're not talking here specifically about Article 6, we're talking more generally about the carbon market and about the voluntary market in particular. The initiative, the Voluntary Carbon Market Global Dialogue, it produced some really interesting and useful recommendations on the role of governments to support private activity in the carbon market. It'd be great if you could say a little bit more about the process which you went through last year and also some of the main takeaways.
Well, definitely. Thank you very much, Hugh. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here today. Indeed, last year we had the VCM, the Voluntary Carbon Market Global Dialogue, to bring the voices of the Global South in the center of discussions of voluntary carbon markets. And that was not without a reason. Even today, but generally over the past years, most of the discussions that have been going on carbon markets have been led fiercely from the Global North, and very much focusing on the integrity on how the carbon credits finally end up in registries or in claims or in whatever with the buyers of the carbon credits, therewith overlooking what the money that carbon credits can bring to countries is actually doing. And that was our starting point last year when we worked together with our partners in Asia, in Africa and in South America, and with sponsorship from Vera, where we tried to turn things upside down and look at things, okay, what can carbon markets actually do to enhance the achievement and the increase of ambitions of NDCs in developing countries? And that turned out quite interesting. So we had 11 stakeholder consultations in Asia, in Africa, in South America, to basically collect opinion on, well, from governments, from NGOs, from companies, from investors, from all those that are active in the Global South in getting projects done. Especially for governments in developing countries, this was quite a, well, novel experience, because voluntary carbon markets and governments, that does not go logically hand in hand. On the contrary, it is, well, participants in voluntary carbon market ever since their inception have done their very best to stay far away from governments. And governments at the same time thought, okay, well, something's going on, but let's not interfere. And as long as something comes to a country, fine. As the market is scaling very much, or has been scaling very much, and investment flows are steadily reaching developing countries, it has come about time that governments in developing countries start realizing what can voluntary carbon markets do to achieve NDCs, but basically to get climate policy implemented and financed in the countries. And during our discussions, it turned up that, well, it was a kind of, well, eye-opening for host country government participants what carbon markets could actually do. And during discussions, it became clear that for most host country governments, whether the carbon finance comes through purely voluntary carbon markets or through Article 6 with the entering accounting does not really matter too much. The most important thing is that finance comes to the country in order to finance policies that need to happen, from which so far finance is happening. And whether that is from the international corporate sector or from international public climate finance, that is not so much important. The most important thing is that finance comes in. Well, having realized that, and during the discussions, we came up with a number of things. The carbon market is growing like mad at this moment, mostly fueled by corporate voluntary commitments to go net zero. In order to get the money where it needs to go, it is time for host country governments to take control and realize what carbon markets can do for them. That is, in the first place, by getting to know what's happening in the country in the first place. So what has been going on in the land use sector, in the energy sector, in the industry sector, in the transport sector, know what is going on in the countries, and taking it from there, prioritize where they would like to have money flowing for future investments. Next, there will be an action of basically investment promotion, trying to steer climate finance, carbon finance into their priority sectors. And that remains to be seen, that is where the market is, determining whether that is under Article 6 or whether that is not under Article 6, whether it goes with corresponding adjustments or not. The main thing is how to get the stuff done on the ground. That same switch of perspective also counts for investors and project developers, which I said have been trying to avoid government in host countries in voluntary markets as much as they have could over the past years. We came to realize that when companies and governments actually liaise, join forces, they can jointly identify sectors that have priority for government, and that might be most interesting to get money to. So starting a exchange of knowledge, exchange of experience between, on the one hand, the private sector, on the other hand, host country governments, could be one of the most important steps to bring carbon markets to work and to bring the carbon finance to where it actually does the good work we want it to do, namely cause change and cause sustainable development. I can go on for a pretty longer while, but I think those are the major takeaways, that governments have woken up and are trying to place carbon markets into their policy frames, and then focusing very much on how do we channel finance to our priority sectors, and that corporates could very much chip in to that and share knowledge, share experiences with government actors to make it all work. Over to you, back to you, Hugh.
Great, thanks very much, Adriaan. I mean, I think there's some themes which are coming through so far from across the different speakers so far. I mean, one of those is the value of dialogue, whether that's between governments, whether it's across the government and the private sector, and that's come through from a few people so far. And then another one is on this this potential for the host country to think clearly about how carbon markets can support what they want to achieve in a way that maybe wasn't done so much in the voluntary carbon market in the past, where you did have a bit of a disconnect between the public sector and private action under the voluntary market. Andrea, I think you're going to talk about some of these points as well. We're going to come to you now. So IETA has been following Article 6 negotiations for years and has done a really good job working to bring the private sector perspective into the negotiations. You published a position paper ahead of the recent negotiations in Bonn, which took place earlier this month, which outlined some key recommendations for how governments can encourage private sector investment under Article 6. Could you share some of these recommendations and talk a little bit about the extent to which you're seeing these being adopted, or at least thought about, by governments so far following COP26?
Thanks, Hugh. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here. Indeed, at IETA, we leverage the expertise of our over 200 members, very diverse memberships that cover all of the carbon market activity cycle. We have members that are interested in Article 6 as potential generators of projects and units, those who are looking at it as buyers, and then the whole market infrastructure. So within these very diverse memberships, we managed to reach consensus on a discussion paper. It's a short paper, and here, if you'll allow me, after I speak, I'll copy the link in the chat so everyone can access it. As I said, it's a short paper. Its main intention was to remind governments around the world about the level of interest in Article 6 that we see in the private sector. It was Katie mentioned enthusiasm. There was certainly enthusiasm after the agreement in Glasgow, and we still see that enthusiasm, that willingness to enter the market, access the market, and do something. And especially the investments that can be unlocked through the right frameworks are there. And that's something we wanted to stress and underline with this paper. This paper, as I said, is quite short. It's 6 sections. We titled them Intention, Authorization, Transparency, Interoperability, Accountability, and Capacity Building. It contains several recommendations. Some are quite simple, almost obvious, I would say. It's very important, for example, that a country communicates its intention to use Article 6 to be a buyer, a seller, or both in the mechanisms. Then we touch upon the need for letters of authorization, the needs for firm commitment to corresponding adjustments, which are things that I think are quite widely shared across government, private sectors, and all stakeholders and observers. Something that we all believe needs to be there to have functioning Article 6 mechanisms. But then we also touch upon some of the points that outline our vision for a potential Article 6 market. For example, we argue in favor of fungible tradable credits. It's steps that should come further down the line as more countries engage in Article 6 as sellers and buyers. Then we allowed our vision for the interaction between Article 6 and the voluntary carbon markets, which is something Adriaan touched upon. I think that the main theme cutting across the paper is that the involvement of governments, both buying governments and host governments, is fundamental. Carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets, but also the CDM before then had limited government involvement. Even in the CDM, letters of authorization. There was some involvement of governments, but definitely not to the same extent of what is required now in Article 6. And I think gradually countries are realizing that, and they're also realizing what it's needed, and what are the steps and the thought process they need to go through to fully take advantage of the benefits of Article 6. I think we are at the stage where Article 6, particularly Article 6.2, waiting for the 6.4 mechanism, hopefully in a not too distant future. Article 6.2 is a kind of a blank canvas for governments. It sets a frame, some boundaries, the accounting framework especially, but then what countries make of it, starting from whether they want to use it or not, and then how to use it, that's all almost solely down to the parties engaging in the cooperative approaches. So, I won't spend time. I see there are several good questions in the chat. I won't spend time reiterating the benefits of Article 6 according to IETA, all the good research and modeling we've done on the benefits of well-designed international carbon market. that, and I hope we can have some good discussion with the panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. And yeah, we've got a lot of really good questions which are coming through on the side. So we'll get to those in about 5 minutes, I think, to make sure we have enough time for questions. I had one question of my own, and then after I've asked it, if anyone on the panel wants to respond to anything that anyone else has said, please feel free to do so at this point. But my question was, Adriaan, it was mostly for you, but others can answer it as well. One of the things that you talked about in the Global Dialogue paper last year is the potential for action under carbon markets at greater scale if you have connections between the public sector and the private sector. So moving from the project level up to sectoral or national level action. And it'd be great if you could just talk a little bit more about the recommendations which you had there, and then others might want to come in on this point as well. The idea that if you have collaboration and you have involvement of the public sector, you're able to do stuff at a larger scale than maybe you have been able to in the past.
Sure, I'd love to. Well, typically, voluntary carbon market involvement, voluntary carbon market projects are projects one by one, whether they are in the land use sector, but also in the renewable energy sector, in the transport sector, in the waste sector, what have you. It's typically one project developer that does one little thing, establishes one baseline, and then starts generating carbon credits from there. That is nice for this small portion of carbon credits, but it doesn't really lead to transformational change in the host country. And the potential is there. For instance, if host countries want to transition their waste sector, or want to develop their transport sector, or want to really get their development together in offline energy, then carbon markets do have the possibility to scale by engaging in sectoral approaches. So far, sectoral approaches have been mostly debated in the land use sector, more specifically in forestry. But that concept of jurisdictional sectoral approaches would also work in any of the other sectors. And that is in particular where governments can play a pivotal role in defining those sectors and then in facilitating everything that is needed to, well, get investments in those sectors running, by establishing baselines, by identifying local participants, by empowering local participants, by ensuring legislation, by everything you need to attract investment to that specific sector and get it going. And then for individual investors, for instance, in the waste or in the transport sector, it could be highly advantageous, because most of the things that you would need to repeat and reinvent again on a case-by-case basis would have been organized already on that sectoral level. So one of our recommendations coming from the VCM Global Dialogue was, do have a look at sectoral and jurisdictional approaches and try to get that done also in other sectors other than the land use, especially the forestry sector, because there is potential galore, and this is in particular where carbon markets could help scale up transition.
Great, thank you for that answer. Katie, do you want to come in on this point as well?
Yeah, I mean, the things that Adriaan is saying there are really inspirational to me. I think that I love that idea that we can get some experience collaborating with the private sector and our host country governments. And as we build that high degree of trust and experience together, you can get blended public and private finance to really tackle these kind of landscape scale or broader jurisdictional scale activities where government is investing in those things that government does well, and the private sector can take that cream in terms of units from their investment. And I think that the most important thing about that is that, particularly in our region, in the Asia Pacific, there is a very significant climate finance gap that needs to
I think we've lost Katie, at least temporarily. So, I mean, is there anyone else, Andrea, Veronika, do you want to come in on this point, or anything else that's been said so far before we turn to questions? Yeah.
Perhaps try and continue Katie's point about the climate finance gap, and Katie's back.
Yeah, Katie.
Well,
if you want to come back in, Katie, we've you've returned?
No, I think I've said enough, but thank you. Sorry, my connection's not that great today.
That's fine. Andrea, over to you then.
I was going to say we clearly see that climate finance gap, and we see from our point of view the private sector being willing to finance mitigation activities across the world. What we need is a clear framework, a clear framework on the use of international units under Article 6 for compliance towards NDCs and the schemes that private sector entities may be subject to in various jurisdictions, as well as clarity on the claims that can be made on the basis of different types of units in the voluntary market space. So what the private sector can what uses the private sector can make of different types of units is important to unlock these investments and deliver financing where it's needed, especially north-south investment flows. So it's mostly about the rules and the frameworks in place.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And Veronika, I mean, when Katie was speaking earlier, she talked about some of the feedback which has been received from private actors. So some of the value which is seen in the work which IPCOS is doing, and then also some of the challenges which they have in investment. It'd be interesting to hear a bit more about what you're hearing from Swiss companies, and what are the main barriers that they see if they are looking to invest in adjusted units under Article 6? What are the values which they see you bringing from the work which you're doing as the government?
Well, I'd say in general, there's growing interest that we see, at least or observe, for the ones, engaging in investments or in that field, but also for the ones purchasing. But of course, there is still, it's a bit of an unknown. It's a bit of a, the biggest challenge here is to get the things rolling. That is true between the governments for agreements, but also, of course, with the private actors. So I think what we observe is certainly a growing interest and a growing understanding how this is going to work. It remains, of course, a voluntary decision of every private actor for voluntary engagements to, go with the standard of the Article 6, yes or no. But I think it's we very much welcome and have, are very glad of the first pioneering partners from private sector going this journey with us and testing it out. We had at the last COP, the Swiss major retailer Coop, who announced that they would test this and use the agreement with Peru for a mitigation engagement for a voluntary climate purpose. So I think it just needs, before there's a discussion about legitimacy or if it's possible or not, I think we just need those courageous ones to go out there and try and do it, get the lessons learned, and we see from there how best we can engage for climate action. So I think the interest is growing, the understanding is growing, and I think it also takes me back one of the questions that was posed in the chat, around I use the word guarantees that the framework agreements of Switzerland provide. Maybe a better word is actually legal certainty. I apologize maybe for the word guarantees, but they do provide legal certainty. Particularly the question was regarding if one of the two cooperating countries has changing government and then does not follow through by the ground rules. It does not apply the corresponding adjustment in very particular terms. Well, that is exactly what we're trying to tackle through these agreements. They are legally binding, and the first possibility to withdraw from the agreement is actually in the year 35. So after the NDC implementation period, after the reporting and the corresponding adjustment to be happening. So if a country would not stick with the rules, this is violation of international law. We hope this provides a lot of certainty. There's a lot of political will and bilateral engagements around these agreements that are, just as strong as legal certainty as well. But of course, to be very transparent, there is some remaining risk on the investor. That is very clear. What we did try to do is along the way to integrate some safeguards, transparency, if countries are following through with the corresponding adjustment on a particular note, so that everyone's got a sense whether the countries are sticking to what they have actually themselves committed and legally bound to.
Thanks very much. And just Veronika, sticking with you for one other question from the chat, and then we'll move on to other panelists. The question which came through is whether Switzerland's intending to widen the scope of bilateral agreements to new NAI, which I think is non-Annex 1 countries. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about your plans beyond the bilateral agreements you have in place right now.
Well, we do have further discussions with other countries. We're in fact expecting further bilateral agreements to be signed still this year. There is a web page on our government web that provides information that is public. Of course, not all of these discussions are public, but we have discussions and signed intentions, declarations of intent to cooperate with the government of Morocco, the government of Chile. That is the ones that are public at this point.
Great, thank you for that. Before going to other questions, there's a question in the chat which we should really have started with, which is an explanation of Article 6. And you've done very well getting this far through this discussion without this explanation. So well done to the questioner there. But I mean, Article 6 is the part of the Paris Agreement which allows parties to the Paris Agreement to transfer mitigation, so to transfer emission reductions between each other, essentially, in order to achieve their NDCs. So emission reductions achieved in one country can be counted by another country or by other entities outside of the Paris framework, so airlines and voluntary actors. It can allow them to use those emission reductions towards their own targets rather than the host country. And some of the motivations behind this is, firstly, the idea that decarbonisation opportunities are more in some places than they are in others. There's more opportunities to abate emissions in some places than others. It's also more cost effective to do so in some places than others. And overall, what we're trying to do is achieve a global temperature goal, and allowing flexibility in how this can be achieved across borders makes sense. So that is essentially Article 6 in a nutshell. There's a few different parts of this, and we can share more information afterwards on the fundamentals of Article 6. I'm going to come now back to you, Katie, with a question which we received in the chat about the standard that projects have to comply with to be eligible under IPCOS. So are you thinking, I know you're using Article 6.2, which is doesn't have a kind of specific standard which has to be used. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about how you're thinking about the rules, requirements, methodologies, etc., that will be used by projects.
Absolutely, Hugh. And while I answer this question, maybe I can go some way to answering Anshari's question about whether or not we'll cover avoidance type projects as well. I think that this points a little bit to some of the challenges of working under Article 6.2. I think it was Andrea who said that there's a frame there, but mostly a blank slate. And so what we need to do is to be as consistent as possible with the intentions of the Paris Agreement, and consistent as possible with the broader rule book around Article 6, while also operating somewhat a little bit in the dark. We want to have, we want both host countries and buyers to have absolute confidence that what IPCOS is delivering is something that overall builds a stable, credible market, and that means that the units meet the standards of integrity. I think people broadly understand what most of those standards are. It's important to us that we consult really closely with all of our partners on this. So our guidelines, when they're released, will be very explicit about these things, but we are actually in the process of sitting down with all of the potential partners and saying, well, what would you expect to see in these guidelines? What criteria would make an IPCOS unit attractive to you? We are not aiming for the lowest cost abatement out there, so I think we can set that standard quite high, but it will encompass the usual things that you would expect to see, things that bring credibility to offset units, the permanence and additionality, and we'll also ensure that all of the units produced are correspondingly adjusted. When it comes to whether or not we will cover avoidance type projects, we are trying to finesse things a little bit and keep a close eye on what's happening in Article 6 negotiations, watching that very closely at Bonn and trying to take that into account. And we'll raise these issues in our consultations with the private sector and with host country governments to understand what action they want to take and what kind of units they want to buy. I guess we also have the benefit here in Australia of a review of international unit integrity that's being undertaken by one of our important institutions, the Climate Change Authority. They're looking at this very question right now, what constitutes a high integrity unit generated internationally, and they'll provide advice to the government on that, and that will help, that will feed into our process as well. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Katie. Andrea, there's a question for you in the chat as well, which is about seeking clarification on CORSIA credits. It's a bit of a technical question. So if carbon credits are generated domestically and retired by domestic airlines involved in international sectors, I think involved in CORSIA, will the host country still be obliged to carry out a corresponding adjustment as all the activities carried on within the same national boundaries? So if you're able to provide an answer to that, and then if there's anything else you want to respond to as well that we've heard, feel free to do so.
Okay, so if the credit is transferred to the CORSIA scheme, there must be a corresponding adjustment irrespective of where the credit is generated and the airline is based. The host country will have to authorize a credit for so-called other international mitigation purposes. That credit becomes eligible for CORSIA, and then it's airlines that are part of CORSIA can buy these credits and retire it to offset some of their emissions. So that's my understanding of the scheme and the answer to the question. I think there was one question about countries. What countries beyond Switzerland are looking most optimistic on Article 6? Well, I think we have Australia here. One of the reasons why Katie was invited is that Australia is one of the countries going ahead. Japan is another front runner with a joint crediting mechanism, the CDM, which is undergoing a significant review, and we're expecting a sharp increase of the number of credits that will generate. And then for the rest, I think from the buying sides, we're still early stages. So I think South Korea is looking at 6.2. There are some pilot projects amongst EU member states, but still definitely still early stages, and we hope more countries will follow suit. So I'll hand over to you here.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm determined should exist by this time next year is a global map showing the state of Article 6 development across the world, because I just think there is a lot going on, I think, in countries, sometimes at the development stage, sometimes it's further on than that, but it's not always clear, and there are some nuances between how all of this is done, and I think some kind of global map would be helpful for all stakeholders. So determine that will exist by this time next year, so those questions are answered in a really clear way. Adriaan, a question which is a few people have liked in the chat, so I think it's one which a few people are interested in, is on the fundamental difference between the voluntary carbon market and the Itmo mechanism of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And this got a lot of attention last year. There's different views on some of the kind of interactions between these two. But I know that this is one of the things that you again looked at in the VCM Global Dialogue, asking governments to give some direction on how they'll treat the voluntary carbon market, etc. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more from you on this question.
It is definitely an issue that pops up again and again, and not without a reason, of course. Fundamentally, however, there is fundamentally, and let's just agree on that, there is little difference between a carbon credit transaction under Article 6 or under a voluntary standard, because in the end it is that under a baseline and crediting scheme, emissions are reduced, are certified, and then moved to somewhere else for whatever other goal. The main difference between the Article 6 transaction and a transaction, for instance, well, under any voluntary standard, under any verified standard, is in the accounting, is how that carbon credit ends up in national registers, in emission accounts of companies, and how these again relate to emission registries of the countries where they are in. accounting is the main difference. Having said that, with that accounting, a huge amount of work comes with it, because in many developing countries, no such accounting yet exists. So far, and then that's legacy of the Kyoto Protocol and CDM, emissions in most of the developing countries are not yet in registries and in emissions registries, like they are, for instance, in Switzerland, or like they are here in the Netherlands, where I am, or in any OECD country. And in order to be able to account for an emission reduction transfer from, for instance, Kenya to Switzerland, or from Colombia to the Netherlands, Colombia and Kenya need to get into, well, setting up a emissions registry that is compatible with what we have in OECD countries. And that is a major effort. Having said that, and here again comes, what do we do? What do we do first? Or speaking from the Colombian or from the Kenyan side, what do we do first? What enjoys our greatest priority? So of course, the accounting is one of many things on the shopping list that needs to be done. But there are many more things on the shopping list that need to be done, like, well, defining the sectors where the finance should flow to, trying to empower local actors rather than all of the usual suspects from Europe or the United States coming in and developing the projects. There's a lot of things that countries want to get done in order to fully participate in carbon markets. And the accounting, the bookkeeping under Article 6 is only one of them.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to come back to that question to round us off. So for we're going to ask for a 30-second answer to that question of what should a government do first? So if you're a government thinking about this, what would you do first? What's your recommendation? So that's where we're going to end in a minute or two's time. Veronika, you've got your hand up to answer this. And at the same time, there's a question in the chat about whether any private company is able to develop projects under your agreements or only Swiss companies. So it'd be great if you could quickly answer that one as well.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to engage on exactly that area. I think there were questions on a global scale, where to look to as a private company, and also in particular in the Swiss case. So just on the very global level, to complement what's been said, there is many activities ongoing, but I would just also encourage looking at the host countries. It's quite encouraging what the ones that have started in the national discussion, the national frameworks to decide what they want, how they want to use national carbon markets. They are starting to be ready to provide authorizations and guide which activities are eligible for Article 6. So that's also somewhere to look to more and more. That's very encouraging. There's been these particular questions on the Swiss scheme. So firstly, let me clarify for the Swiss NDC compliance. This is done through the Swiss motor fuel importers. It's an obligation under national law. It is together they have joined in the CLIC Foundation. So if anyone is interested to contribute and sell Itmos for NDC compliance of Switzerland, your contact partner is the CLIC Foundation. Of course, anyone else can, for other objectives, go directly through the governments, as I was saying before. It is very clear that if a company or an entity is using that Itmos for its voluntary mitigation objective, it cannot be used toward the Swiss NDC. That is the very spirit of our bilateral agreements. It's the other side of the coin that our agreements provide access to private companies to these Paris-aligned carbon credits. And very likewise, also the agreements are also very clear that the means that are used to purchase Itmos cannot be counted as international climate finance. All this is in the spirit of unlocking true additional mitigation activities and action that would otherwise not have happened. And the very last point on the engagement that is possible in the Swiss case, the bilateral agreements allow generally secondary transfers. It is to be said that in the early days, we're not foreseen to issue international units because we are awaiting international infrastructure as a registry. Otherwise, things get very complicated in bilateral schemes. But during this period until international units will be issued through the bilateral schemes and linked to the international evolving infrastructure, we will recognize Itmos in the national Swiss registry, but they only are viable in the Swiss legal framework. So within that domain, there will be possible from early days to do secondary transfers. At the international level, this is possible, but we may need to wait for that infrastructure to be practical.
Great, thank you very much. And we have 1 minute left. So Katie or Andrea, do either of you want to answer this question of, if you're a government trying to work through how to support action within your jurisdiction under Article 6, where do you start first? What's the first recommendation? In 20 seconds, if possible, so we can wrap up in time.
I don't know if I can say it in 20 seconds. It's a kind of one of those everything all at once type answers, isn't it? I do agree that accounting and reporting needs to be there in order to deliver the credibility that's required by the private sector. But first and foremost, for me, a framework in which a government can understand what its own national interest is vital. They need to be able to identify where the available abatement is, what cost it can be brought in, and whether or not carbon markets are really the right mechanism to achieve that. That's got to be there.
Perfect. Andrea.
Yeah, in 20 seconds, I'll build on what Katie said. Understanding what the options are, make decisions that are in the best interest of the country, especially in the long run, and then stick to those decisions, stick to that framework, provide stability for the private sector so that they can make the investment decisions and deliver the mitigation outcomes. Also, I would say let's not necessarily reinvent the wheel. There's an existing infrastructure through the voluntary carbon market, through the CDM that can be leveraged and will deliver results.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's listened to this. Thank you very much as well to all of our panelists, so to Katie, Veronika, Adriaan and Andrea. Thank you for your time here. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has learned a lot from this as well. This is the third webinar in a series that we're running over the course of this year, focusing on different aspects of Article 6 implementation. So you can look out for our fourth webinar in September, which is going to look at the value of Article 6 credits and some questions around pricing, which I think is an issue which is on lots of people's minds. We'd like to just end by thanking BMW UK, the German ministry, for their support in setting up these webinars and allowing us to go forward with them. And with that, I will close. We will send out a recording of this as well as links to some of the documents which have been talked about so everyone can follow up. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.